The crisp autumn air of the Sierra Nevada mountains did little to cool the simmering frustration in Brad Pitt's gut. He'd come to this remote corner of California for solitude, a respite from the relentless glare of Hollywood. For a week, he'd been living off the grid in a rustic cabin. The only sounds the rustle of pine needles and the crackle of his nightly campfire. But the tranquility had been shattered 2 days ago. It started with the faint, almost imperceptible whine carried on the wind. At first, he dismissed it as a coyote pup or a trick of the mountain air. But the sound persisted, a mournful, desperate cry that tugged at something deep within him. By the second day, the whimper had become a constant, heartbreaking lament. Brad, a man whose quiet life was underpinned by a fierce sense of justice for the vulnerable, couldn't ignore it any longer. He'd spent his morning methodically packing a small rucksack, water, a first aid kit, a high-powered flashlight, and the heavy-duty wire cutters from his toolkit. He slung a well-worn leather jacket over his shoulders, the same one he'd favored in a dozen action films, its familiar weight a strange comfort in the unnerving silence of the wilderness. His search led him through dense thickets of manzanita and across jagged granite outcroppings. The whining grew louder, more frantic, guiding him like a beacon. Finally, he saw it. Tucked away in a small, almost invisible clearing was a crudely constructed cage. Inside, a magnificent creature paced restlessly, its fur the color of spun gold, its intelligent eyes wide with terror. It was a dog, but not just any dog. This was a Caucasian Shepherd, a breed known for its immense size, fierce loyalty, and a lineage stretching back to the ancient guardians of the Caucasus Mountains. It was a dog that had no business being in a poacher's trap in the middle of the Sierra Nevada. As Brad approached, the dog let out a low growl, a rumble that vibrated through the soles of his boots. It was a warning, but also a plea. He could see the raw, bloody marks on its leg where a crude snare had tightened, the metallic tang of blood hanging heavy in the air. The cage itself was a testament to the poacher's cruelty, a rusty iron monstrosity with a spring-loaded door designed to snap shut with brutal efficiency. "Easy there, big fella," Brad said, his voice a low, calming murmur. He moved with the deliberate, unthreatening grace he'd honed over years of dealing with temperamental co-stars and skittish animals on set. "I'm not going to hurt you." He knelt, his eyes level with the caged animal, trying to project an aura of calm. The dog's growl softened to a whimper, its massive head tilting in a gesture of weary curiosity. Just as Brad reached for the wire cutters, a new sound split the air, the crunch of boots on dry leaves. He froze, every muscle tensing. He wasn't alone. 2 men emerged from the trees, their faces obscured by the shadows of their wide-brimmed hats. They were dressed in worn camouflage gear, their movements economical and predatory. The taller of the two carried a high-caliber rifle with a scope, its cold, metallic sheen a stark contrast to the natural beauty of the forest. The other man, shorter and stockier, had a length of thick rope coiled over his shoulder and a long, wicked-looking knife strapped to his thigh. They hadn't seen him yet. Brad's mind raced, his actor's instinct for improvisation kicking into overdrive. He was outnumbered and outgunned. A direct confrontation was suicide. He needed a distraction, a way to even the odds. His eyes darted around the clearing, searching for anything he could use. His gaze fell on a large, precariously balanced boulder on the ridge above the poacher's position. It was a long shot, a scene straight out of one of his movies, but it was the only shot he had. With a deep breath, he began to move, his body a silent shadow against the mottled sunlight and shade of the forest floor. He circled around the clearing, using the dense undergrowth for cover, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The poachers were focused on their prize, their voices a low, guttural murmur as they approached the cage. They were professionals, he realized, their callous disregard for the animal's suffering a chilling testament to their trade. This wasn't about sport, it was about profit. A dog like this, a rare and powerful breed, would fetch a small fortune on the black market. He reached the ridge, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The boulder was even larger up close, its surface rough and cold beneath his fingertips. He could hear the poachers below, their laughter a harsh, grating sound that set his teeth on edge. They were trying to force a heavy chain around the dog's neck, the animal's frantic snarls, and the clanking of metal echoing through the otherwise silent forest. With a primal roar of exertion, Brad put his shoulder to the boulder and pushed. For a terrifying moment, it didn't budge. He pushed again, every ounce of his strength, every fiber of his being focused on this one desperate act. The rock groaned, shifted, and then, with a deafening crack, it began to roll. It careened down the ridge, gathering speed and momentum, a juggernaut of granite and earth aimed directly at the two unsuspecting figures below. The taller poacher looked up just in time, his eyes widening in a mask of pure terror. He let out a strangled cry, a sound that was abruptly cut off as the boulder crashed through their position with the force of a small explosion. The world dissolved into a chaotic symphony of splintering wood, flying debris, and the sharp, acrid smell of gunpowder as the rifle discharged on impact. Brad didn't wait to see the aftermath. He scrambled down the ridge, his mind a whirlwind of adrenaline and uncertainty. He had to get to the dog. He had to get it out of that cage before the dust settled, before any other poachers in the area were drawn to the commotion. He reached the clearing, his lungs burning, his eyes scanning the scene of devastation. The cage was miraculously intact, but the poachers were gone, vanished as if swallowed by the earth itself. The only evidence of their presence was the splintered stock of the rifle and a dark, spreading stain on the forest floor. But as he fumbled with the lock on the cage, a new, more terrifying sound reached his ears. It wasn't the whine of the dog or the rustle of the wind. It was the rhythmic, thumping beat of rotor blades, growing steadily louder, closer. A helicopter. The poachers weren't just a couple of local thugs. They were part of a sophisticated, well-equipped operation, and they were coming back for their prize. Brad's blood ran cold. He had just declared war on a faceless, ruthless enemy, and the opening salvo had just been fired. He was no longer just a man trying to save a dog. He was a target, and in the vast, unforgiving wilderness of the Sierra Nevada, there was nowhere to hide. Part 2. The thudding of the helicopter blades grew into a deafening roar, a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to shake the very ground beneath Brad's feet. He worked frantically at the cage door, his fingers clumsy with a mixture of adrenaline and dread. The lock was a crude but effective piece of ironmongery, and his wire cutters, designed for fencing, were struggling against the thick, hardened steel. The dog inside, sensing the new threat, had fallen silent, its massive body pressed against the back of the cage, its golden eyes fixed on the sky. "Come on, you piece of junk," Brad muttered, sweat stinging his eyes as he put all his weight into the cutters. With a final, agonized screech of metal on metal, the lock snapped. He yanked the door open, and the Caucasian Shepherd bolted out, a blur of golden fur and raw power. It didn't run far, however. It stopped a few feet away, its head cocked, its intelligent gaze fixed on Brad. There was no aggression in its eyes, only a wary gratitude. The helicopter was almost directly overhead now, a dark, menacing shape against the brilliant blue of the California sky. It was a sleek, black machine, unmarked and vaguely military in its design. A side door slid open, and a figure leaned out, a rifle with a long-range scope cradled in his arms. Brad didn't need a film script to know what was coming next. He and the dog were exposed, a perfect target in the small clearing. "This way," he yelled, diving for the cover of a dense thicket of pines. The dog, as if understanding the urgency in his voice, was right behind him, its massive paws surprisingly silent on the forest floor. A split second later, the ground where they had just been standing erupted in a shower of dirt and pine needles as a single, high-caliber round slammed into the earth. The shot was a chilling testament to the shooter's skill, a precise, calculated warning. They ran, a man and a dog united in a desperate flight for survival. The helicopter pursued them relentlessly, its shadow a constant, oppressive presence. The shooter in the chopper was toying with them, firing rounds that kicked up dirt just behind their heels, a cruel game of cat and mouse. Brad's lungs burned, and his legs ached, but he couldn't stop. He knew that the moment he faltered, the game would be over. He led them on a weaving, erratic path through the forest, using the natural terrain to his advantage. He scrambled over fallen logs, slid down steep, scree-covered slopes, and pushed through dense, thorny undergrowth that tore at his clothes and skin. The dog, despite its size, was incredibly agile, matching him stride for stride. its powerful muscles propelling it over obstacles with effortless grace. As they burst into a clearing, Brad saw their chance. A river, wide and fast-flowing, cut a swathe through the landscape. The water was a churning, white-capped torrent, fed by the melting snows of the high Sierras. It was a dangerous, almost suicidal option, but it was their only hope of breaking the helicopter's line of sight. "We've got to jump," he shouted to the dog, his voice barely audible over the roar of the river and the thumping of the rotor blades. The dog looked at him, its eyes filled with a mixture of fear and trust. It had been through so much already: the snare, the cage, the pursuit. Could it trust this strange, two-legged creature who had freed it only to lead it into more danger? Brad didn't give it time to hesitate. He took a running leap, his body a taut arc against the sky, and plunged into the icy water. The shock of the cold was like a physical blow, stealing his breath and sending a jolt of pain through his entire body. He surfaced, gasping, the powerful current immediately grabbing him, pulling him downstream. He looked back just in time to see the Caucasian Shepherd leap into the river after him, a magnificent, desperate act of faith. The helicopter hovered over the river, the shooter unable to get a clear shot in the turbulent water. Brad and the dog were swept downstream, tossed, and turned by the relentless current. Brad fought to keep his head above water, his arms and legs flailing against the powerful pull of the river. The dog, a natural swimmer, fared better, its powerful legs kicking, its massive head held high. They were carried for what felt like an eternity, the world a blur of swirling water and green, forested banks. Finally, the river widened and slowed, the current losing its anaconda-like grip. Brad, exhausted and half-drowned, managed to pull himself onto a sandy bank, his body trembling with cold and exertion. The dog followed, shaking its massive frame and sending a shower of icy water over him. For a long moment, they lay there, two unlikely companions, catching their breath under the vast, indifferent sky. The sound of the helicopter had faded, but Brad knew they were far from safe. The poachers would be searching for them on the ground now, their resources and their ruthlessness a constant, unseen threat. As the adrenaline began to recede, a new, more chilling thought crept into Brad's mind. The poachers had a helicopter. They had high-powered, military-grade weapons. This wasn't just a local operation. This was something far bigger, far more organized. And they were after one specific dog. Why? What made this Caucasian Shepherd so valuable that they would deploy such resources to capture it? He looked at the dog, who was now licking its wounded leg, its golden eyes filled with a quiet intelligence. It was a beautiful animal, to be sure, but there had to be more to it than that. He had a sinking feeling that he hadn't just stumbled into a simple case of animal cruelty. He had stumbled into the middle of something far more complex and far more dangerous. He had saved the dog, but in doing so, he had become entangled in a web of intrigue and violence that stretched far beyond the remote wilderness of the Sierra Nevada. And he had a terrible feeling that the poachers weren't just after the dog anymore. They were after him too. The hunter had become the hunted. And in this deadly game, there were no rules, no second chances, and no guarantee of a Hollywood ending. Part 3. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of fiery orange and deep purple. The chill in the air intensified, a stark reminder of their vulnerability. Brad, his clothes still damp and clinging to his skin, knew they couldn't stay put. The poachers would be combing the area, and the riverbank was too exposed. He needed to find shelter, a place where they could rest, and he could formulate a plan. He rose to his feet, his muscles protesting with every movement. The dog, who he had started to mentally call Buddy, watched him with an unwavering gaze. There was a bond forming between them, forged in the crucible of their shared ordeal. It was a silent understanding, a mutual respect between two creatures who had been thrown together by fate and were now dependent on each other for survival. Brad led them away from the river, deeper into the forest. The terrain grew more rugged, the landscape a labyrinth of granite cliffs and ancient, towering sequoias. The fading light cast long, dancing shadows that played tricks on the eyes, turning every rock and tree into a potential threat. Brad found himself constantly scanning their surroundings, his senses on high alert. He was no stranger to playing heroes on screen, but this was real. The danger was palpable, a cold knot of fear in the pit of his stomach. They stumbled upon it by chance, a small, dark opening at the base of a massive granite cliff, almost completely obscured by a curtain of tangled vines. It was a cave, not much larger than a crawlspace, but it was shelter. He cautiously peered inside, his hand resting on the hilt of the large hunting knife he always carried on his belt when he was in the wilderness. The air inside was cool and smelled of damp earth and something else, something musky and vaguely familiar. He clicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The cave was small and shallow, but it was dry. And it wasn't empty. In the far corner, huddled together for warmth, were three small, whimpering bundles of fur. Puppies. They were tiny, their eyes barely open, their coats the same beautiful golden color as their mothers. Buddy let out a soft whine and nudged his way past Brad, his massive form surprisingly gentle as he began to lick his pups, his tail giving a slow, tentative wag. The sight of the puppies hit Brad with the force of a physical blow. It all clicked into place. The poachers weren't just after Buddy. They were after a breeding pair. A female Caucasian Shepherd of this caliber was a prize in itself. But a female with a new litter of purebred pups? That was a gold mine on the exotic animal black market. Each puppy could be sold for tens of thousands of dollars to wealthy, unscrupulous collectors around the world. A new wave of anger washed over Brad, hot and fierce. This wasn't just about cruelty anymore. It was about greed, a callous, calculated exploitation of innocent lives for profit. He looked at Buddy, at the fierce, protective love in her eyes as she nuzzled her pups, and his resolve hardened. He wasn't just fighting for his own life now. He was fighting for this family. He spent the next hour fortifying their makeshift sanctuary. He gathered fallen branches and rocks, creating a crude but effective barrier at the mouth of the cave. He used his knife to strip a young sapling of its branches, fashioning a makeshift spear, a primitive weapon against the poachers' high-tech arsenal. It was a desperate, almost laughable defense, but it was better than nothing. As darkness fell, a new sound joined the symphony of the wilderness, the mournful howl of a wolf. It was answered by another, and then another, until the night was filled with their haunting chorus. Buddy, her ears perked, let out a low growl, her protective instincts on high alert. Then, another sound, one that sent a fresh jolt of fear through Brad. A human voice, carried on the wind. It was distant, but unmistakable. The poachers were closing in. They were using the wolves' howls to mask their own movements, a clever, predatory tactic. Brad extinguished his flashlight, plunging the cave into darkness. He held his breath, his ears straining to catch every sound. He could hear them now, the crunch of their boots, the rustle of their gear, the low murmur of their voices. They were close, terrifyingly close. He could make out snippets of their conversation, their words laced with a cold, professional detachment. They were discussing their strategy, how they would flush him out, how they would retrieve the asset. They weren't just hunters, they were soldiers, mercenaries. And he was their target. One of the voices, a man with a thick Eastern European accent, was giving orders. He was clearly the leader, his voice calm, authoritative, and utterly ruthless. "He can't have gone far," the man said. "He's on foot, and he's with the female. We'll find him. And when we do, make sure you take him alive. The boss wants to have a word with him." Brad's blood ran cold. The boss. There was someone else behind this, someone with the resources and the influence to orchestrate this entire operation. This went far beyond a simple poaching ring. He had stumbled into something far more sinister, a criminal enterprise with a reach that he couldn't even begin to comprehend. Suddenly, a powerful beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the area just outside the cave. They had a spotlight. They were systematically searching the cliff face. Brad's heart hammered against his ribs. He was trapped. There was no escape. He looked at Buddy, at the terrified puppies huddled behind her. He had to do something. He couldn't let them be captured. He gripped his makeshift spear, his knuckles white. It was a fool's hope, a desperate last stand. But he was an actor who had played the hero 100 times. He knew how to sell a performance. He would make them believe he was more dangerous than he was, that he was a force to be reckoned with. The spotlight swept past the entrance to the cave, the beam of light a fleeting, blinding flash. They hadn't seen them yet, but it was only a matter of time. He could hear the leader's voice again, closer this time. "Check the caves," he ordered. "He's in one of them. I can feel it." Brad took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had one advantage. one element of surprise. They thought he was just an actor, a pampered celebrity out of his depth. They had no idea who they were dealing with. He wasn't just Brad Pitt, the movie star. He was Achilles, the warrior. He was Tyler Durden, the anarchist. He was Aldo Raine, the Nazi hunter. He had a whole cast of characters to draw from, a whole arsenal of cinematic skills to unleash. The footsteps stopped directly outside the cave. He could see the silhouettes of two men against the faint glow of their headlamps. This was it, the final act. He readied his spear, his body coiled like a spring. He was about to give the performance of a lifetime. The question was, would it be enough to save them? Or would this be his final, tragic role? Part 4. The beam of a headlamp sliced through the darkness of the cave, pinning Brad in its blinding glare. Well, the voice with the Eastern European accent purred, a sound as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. Look what we have here. The big Hollywood star, playing the hero in the woods. The man stepped into the cave, a towering figure with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He was flanked by two other men, both armed with tactical shotguns, their expressions grim and professional. The leader, however, held no weapon. He didn't need one. His very presence was a weapon, an aura of cold, calculating menace that filled the small space. Brad didn't flinch. He remained perfectly still, his eyes locked on the leader, his makeshift spear held steady. He had learned on countless film sets that stillness could be more intimidating than any sudden movement. It projected an image of control, of fearlessness. "You've caused us a lot of trouble, Mr. Pitt," the leader said, his eyes flicking to Buddy and her pups. "A lot of expense. My employer is not pleased." "Your employer can go to hell," Brad said, his voice low and steady, a perfect imitation of the gravelly tones he'd used in so many of his action roles. The leader chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "I like you, Mr. Pitt. You have spirit. It will be a shame to break it." He took a step forward, his hand reaching for Buddy. "Now, give us the female and the pups, and we might let you walk away from this with most of your pretty face intact." That was the moment Brad had been waiting for. The moment the man's attention was divided. With a guttural roar, he lunged forward, not with the spear, but with his body. He slammed his shoulder into the leader's chest, a move he'd learned from a stunt coordinator on the set of Troy. The man, caught off guard by the sudden, explosive violence, stumbled backward, a look of shocked surprise on his face. The two henchmen raised their shotguns, but they hesitated, their line of fire blocked by their leader. It was the opening Brad needed. He kicked out, his boot connecting with the knee of the closest henchman, a brutal, disabling blow he'd practiced for a fight scene in Mr. and Mrs. Smith. The man screamed and crumpled to the ground. The second henchman, a look of panic in his eyes, swung his shotgun towards Brad. But he was too slow. Buddy, her protective instincts ignited, launched herself at the man, a blur of golden fur and righteous fury. She hit him with the force of a freight train, her powerful jaws closing on his arm. The man shrieked, a sound of pure terror, as the shotgun clattered to the floor of the cave. The leader, recovering his balance, lunged at Brad, his hands reaching for his throat. He was strong, incredibly strong, his grip like a vice. Brad struggled for breath, his vision starting to swim. He was outmatched in a contest of pure strength. He needed to use his wits, his actor's ingenuity. He brought his knee up sharply, a move he'd improvised in a fight scene that had been cut from Fight Club, connecting with the man's groin. The leader grunted, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was enough. Brad twisted, breaking free, and grabbed the fallen shotgun. He didn't hesitate. He brought the butt of the gun up in a sharp, brutal arc, connecting with the side of the leader's head. The man's eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed to the floor, unconscious. Silence descended on the cave, broken only by the whimpering of the puppies and the ragged sound of Brad's breathing. He stood there for a long moment, the shotgun in his hands, his body trembling with the aftershocks of the fight. He had done it. He had actually done it. He had faced down 3 armed mercenaries and won. But he knew it wasn't over. The boss, the man behind this whole operation, was still out there, and he would not give up so easily. Brad knew he had to get Buddy and her pups to safety, and he had to expose this entire criminal enterprise. He used the poachers' own zip ties to secure the 2 conscious henchmen, their threats and curses a testament to their shock and disbelief. He then used their satellite phone to make a call, not to the police, but to a trusted contact, a journalist he had worked with on a documentary about illegal wildlife trafficking. He gave her the coordinates of the cave and a brief, cryptic summary of what had happened. He knew she would understand the urgency and the need for discretion. As the first rays of dawn began to break through the darkness, Brad led Buddy and her pups out of the cave. He had fashioned a makeshift sling for the puppies out of his jacket, and he carried them close to his chest. Buddy walked beside him, her head held high, a silent, loyal guardian. They made their way down the mountain, a strange, unlikely family, leaving the wreckage of the poachers' operation behind them. Brad knew that the road ahead would be long and dangerous. The boss would not let this go. There would be repercussions, threats, a new kind of battle to be fought, not in the wilderness of the Sierra Nevada, but in the glare of the public eye. But as he looked down at the sleeping puppies in his arms and at the magnificent, brave dog at his side, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He had come to the mountains seeking solitude, a respite from the artificial world of Hollywood. He had found something far more real, far more meaningful. He had found a cause worth fighting for. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this was one role he would not be walking away from. The fight was far from over. In fact, it had just begun.